Bueno, bienvenidos y bienvenidas a esta quinta edición de nuestro ciclo de conferencias. Tanto en nombre de Claudia como en el mío les queremos agradecer por la paciencia de estar los sábados acompañándonos en este encuentro. Y bueno, en esta ocasión tenemos el privilegio de contar con otro expositor de lujo que nos va a acompañar en el día de hoy. Por lo pronto ya creo que he empezado un poco mal porque correspondía que Claudia iniciara esta reunión, pero bueno, el fragor del ciclo de conferencias hace que me haya metido yo a hablar, así que perdón, Claudia, si habíamos quedado que...
No hay ningún problema.
No sé si querés decir algo respecto de la introducción antes de que lo presente.
No querría dilatar más el comienzo de la charla. Agradecer al profesor Spatharas, como se pronuncia su apellido, que nos va a hablar sobre The Phenomenology and Social Uses of Contempt in Ancient Greece. El profesor Spatharas pertenece a la Universidad de Creta y la presentación entonces, Emiliano, corre por tu cuenta. Muchas gracias a él y a todos los que están en este momento escuchando la charla.
Bueno, gracias Claudia. Bueno, voy a presentar en castellano al profesor Spatharas. Como siempre, vamos a darle el tiempo de exposición a su conferencia. Él va a desarrollar el tema compartiendo un handout en la pantalla para que podamos seguir las citas y las referencias. Y adelantamos que entonces, como siempre, la idea es que las preguntas las puedan ir haciendo en el chat a medida que avance la charla, y luego Claudia y yo unificaremos esas preguntas para remitírselas al profesor Spatharas, o eventualmente, si ustedes prefieren, para permitirles habilitar el micrófono y que puedan hacer la pregunta oralmente ustedes mismos. Bueno, Dimos Spatharas es quizás uno de los especialistas más productivos y fructíferos en el ámbito de la teoría de las emociones en el mundo griego antiguo, y su área, digamos, de interés y de trabajo se vincula básicamente con el estudio de los oradores áticos y con la retórica antigua. Como dijo Claudia, en la actualidad es profesor asociado en el Departamento de Filología, en la División de Estudios Clásicos de la Universidad de Creta, en Rethymno, y sus áreas de trabajo, además de la oratoria y de la retórica, han circulado esencialmente por el estudio de los sofistas y por las emociones en la antigüedad. También ha trabajado muchas cuestiones vinculadas con la historia social y la historia jurídica de la Atenas clásica. Sus publicaciones son numerosísimas, pero quizás a los efectos de estos encuentros ha editado y sigue editando muchas publicaciones vinculadas con la historia de las emociones en la antigüedad clásica. Con George Kazantzidis es el coeditor de los Trends in Classics, la serie de Ancient Emotions, emociones antiguas, que publica la editorial de Gruyter. Y sus trabajos más recientes incluyen volúmenes coeditados sobre la emoción antigua del asco, o disgust. De vuelta, ahora vamos a entrar en toda una cuestión seguramente de la traducción de algunas emociones del griego al inglés y del inglés al castellano. The Ancient Emotion of Disgust, por Oxford University Press en el 2016. Un volumen también sobre la esperanza, Hope, en la literatura antigua, la historia y el arte también de la antigüedad, publicado en el 2018 por de Gruyter. Y una monografía también sobre las narrativas forenses en las cortes atenienses, un aspecto quizás más vinculado con la cuestión jurídica. Y también ha trabajado mucho sobre la relación entre las emociones y los efectos de la persuasión en el discurso público, ¿no? En Atenas clásica también hay un volumen de Gruyter. Así que, como verán, el profesor Spatharas se ha ocupado de muchas emociones en distintas fuentes de la literatura griega clásica, y creo entonces que hoy nos va a compartir un trabajo sobre el que ha estado analizando básicamente la emoción del desdén o del desprecio. Recién justo estábamos conversando respecto de cómo conviene traducir contempt, pero quizás lo dejo entonces al profesor Spatharas para que él mismo se ocupe de la temática. Su trabajo se titula Fenomenología y usos sociales del desprecio en la antigua Grecia. Así que dimos, muchísimas gracias, Efjaristó Parapolí, y te dejo entonces la pantalla para que puedas compartir tu charla. Muchas gracias.
So I thank you, Claudia and Emiliano, for this very kind invitation, and thank you for this introduction. I'll disappoint our audience, I'm afraid, after this, but I'll try to do my best. The other thing is I seem to have a long paper, but if there's a point where you want to say, just shut up, I will. Okay. My project, my paper today, as you said, focuses on the phenomenology and social uses of contempt in ancient Greece. And this is part of a project in which I participated. The project was organized by Douglas Kearns and Curie Virag. It was a comparative project on Greek and Chinese emotions in antiquity. So my work there was on disgust, and my partner, so to speak, Eric Hatton, worked on the Chinese category of why, which is, there's no one translation, as is commonly the case for his category, but it's a word that in Chinese means awe, admiration, respect, and all that. So the opposite of contempt, in a sense. Now, you will excuse me, I hope, if I start with some conceptual clarifications about contempt, because as is commonly the case, when we use a blanket term to describe an emotion, we cannot really include in our description all the possible aspects of the emotion. So some conceptual clarification, I think, is important, although no definition can give a good idea of what an emotion or an emotional category is, especially if we want to address its phenomenology in different, I'm sorry about this, in different cultures. So let me start with a personal note. This analysis of contempt complements my work on disgust, to which Emiliano referred earlier. And despite the differences, disgust and contempt display similarities, which I think facilitate the work of historians of concepts who want to use emotions heuristically in their attempt to shed light on ancient ethics, social hierarchies, or more broadly, mentalities. As was the case with my research on disgust, in which I worked together with Don Latina. Disgust, a visceral emotion that defiles one's targets by projecting on them physical dirt. My discussion of contempt aims to explore the behaviors, normative transgressions, or moral failures that deserved ancient kataphronesis or periphronesis. Now, because downward contempt commonly involves the agent's real or perceived sense of superiority, the scripts of the emotion concept that we find in our sources help us understand the ways in which ancient societies establish or assert hierarchy and perpetuate social inequalities. As is typically the case with emotion labels, the word contempt, which appears in my title, does not encompass all the possible aspects or modes of looking down on others in modern or ancient societies. One may indicate one's sense of superiority, disdain, contempt, scorn, or indifference through the manipulation of facial expressions, a raised eyebrow or slightly raised upper lip, sideways glances, laughter, irony, and sarcasm, delayed responses or denial to respond, silence, and the use of diminutives. Human societies, the environment we learn to adapt to, are characterized by hierarchies and inequalities. Equality, perceived or real, does not elicit the contempt elicited when the agents and the target's relevant position in hierarchy are different. Downward contempt commonly renders its targets invisible, and thus it is commonly more akin to indifference. Historians of modernity should be interested in the reasons that made Hobbes define contempt restrictively as an affection that requires the agent's social superiority, what we may call passive contempt. The definition of Hobbes is those things which we neither desire nor hate, we are said to contemn. Contempt being nothing else but an immobility or contumacy of the heart in resisting the action of certain things. If I understand the definition correctly, resisting the action of certain things is directly relevant to the agent's sense of superiority or superior position in a hierarchy. Top-down contempt frequently emphasizes status, and thus its agents treat their targets as non-existent. Passive contempt is a constituent element of snobbery and does not necessarily involve ethical judgments. It is a prioristic insofar as its agents take it for granted that they're superior to others. This type of contempt is displayed, for example, by Midias in the democratic environment of classical Athens, an environment in which showcasing and superiority and contempt were incongruous with the ideal of political equality. Because of his full-blown hubris, Midias refuses to treat his fellow citizens, especially the less well-off among them, as human beings. Demosthenes' emphasis on Midias' contempt for his fellow citizens enlists the ideology of equality in support of arguments which intend to isolate his opponent from the Athenian demos. Top-down contempt seems to engulf affective aspects in a more salient fashion. In other words, top-down contempt feels in a certain way when its targets are held responsible for moral failures. In these cases, passive, status-oriented contempt may intensify dismissive judgments by identifying, in an essentialist fashion, poor moral standards with inferiors' inherent baseness. In their public discourse, for example, Athenians commonly took it for granted that barbarians were not sufficiently equipped agents of morality. For example, they were characterized by effeminacy or lack of restraint. Succinctly, top-down moral contempt is seen as a product of low status. More alarmingly, in the case of disgust, low status is identified with defilement, dirt. Because status-oriented, downward passive contempt is characterized by superiors' lofty sense of pride and is therefore dispositional and group-oriented rather than a response to specific individuals, it may be expressed through condescension, complacency, or even pity, let alone brusqueness. Conversely, upward contempt, for example, slaves' ridicule of and gossip about their master's pretentiousness or pompousness, is commonly tacit and invisible. No one, with the exception of the play's spectators, listens to the slaves' chat at the beginning of the piece when they prepare dunk balls with, sorry, this was my son, sorry. Sorry, this was my 3-year-old son, and I cannot explain what I'm doing. So no one, with the exception of the play's spectators, listens to the slaves' chat at the beginning of the piece when they prepare dunk balls with which they feed Trigeus Beetle. When one of the slaves addresses the audience to convey his complaints about his unpleasant toil involving scatophagy, slaves always taste the food that they prepare, he remarks that the beetle is as fussy and haughty as a mistress. Hence, agents of upward contempt may secretly or secretively indicate with words, gestures, or mimicry that their social superiors do not deserve the respect that they demand, even as their behavior in the presence of their masters deceptively points to the opposite direction. Teenagers' disdain for their parents is perhaps a different animal, mainly because their troubled relationship with them is affectionate. Hence, teenagers' contempt is expressed both in private discussions with friends and displayed overtly, commonly through gestures in parents' presence. For example, when the latter listen to their favorite records or discuss politics. The case of Thersites in Iliad 2 is a locus classicus, of course, of upward contempt, despite the intricacies of this passage. And it's also a locus classicus in regard with its consequences for its outspoken agent. In the poem, Thersites' effrontery is underlined by his failure to display due respect for Agamemnon and the Greek leaders. Indeed, his speech questions Agamemnon's leadership and hence involves appraisal rather than just recognition, disrespect. Odysseus' verbal chastising of Thersites, let alone the use of violence to discipline his inferior, emphasizes status rather than the particulars of Thersites' vocal complaints, and thus reinforces through salient dismissiveness the status quo. Contempt, however, commonly arises in cases where status or one's sense of relevant superiority does not seem to be salient. This contempt is significantly different from Hobbes' indifference or passive contempt, and thereby it may be called active contempt. Its object is not the target's position in a social hierarchy. The object of this contempt is the target's person per se, and hence involves appraisal, disrespect. My fictional contempt for, say, colleagues who do not prepare for their classes is a good case in point. Active contempt does not just confirm established hierarchies. It belittles others, that is, persons by way of renegotiating worthiness. For this reason, it commonly involves a sense of closeness or similarity with the target. In this case, the contemptible is in some way comparable with us, but fails to live or perform up to our standards. Recognition, respect, however, may have implications for our feelings of active contempt. Contempt for the professor who does not prepare for her classes involves appraisals concerning expectations about the responsibilities resulting from her rank, but also from the agent's understanding that she or he can become a better professor. Similarly, the agent may feel active contempt for the person who has recently become a professor, but does not, in her view, make the most out of the privileges that go with her promotion. For example, fewer hours of teaching. So, appraisal disrespect can thus serve as a constituent element of recognition disrespect and thus intensify contempt. In some cases, this contempt prompts sarcastic comments in faculty meetings, as you know. In the case of active contempt, commonly centering, as I suggested, on persons rather than status, the agent may act through words or deeds. As Aristotle suggests, contempt is an actualization of low esteem, we will discuss that, on his or her emotion. Agents of active contempt typically employ strategies through which they belittle or shame their targets, and for this reason, being the target of active contempt may be experienced as social death or indeed generate extreme anger. So be careful when you display your contempt. This is why overt displays of contempt come in at a high cost. They may invite retaliation, social exclusion, or exhausting and recurrent episodes of verbal fights, as academics or other professionals working in competitive environments can aver. But apart from generating targets' anger, contempt may also be the product of or concurrent with agents' anger. Now, what I'm going to do next, because this was all I had to say about the concept of contempt or possible definitions of the emotion depending on status and moral evaluations. What I'm going to do next is try to emphasize or discuss a bit the phenomenology of the emotion, verbal and non-verbal modes of expressing the emotion. Now, in the past decades, the universality of contempt has been a topic of scholarly debate. Paul Ekman and Friesen have argued that contempt has a unique repertoire of facial expressions. As they suggested in an early publication on the emotion, the facial expression of contempt is unilateral. The tightened and raised corner of the upper lip is its unique manifestation. Although this is not the place to discuss in detail the universality of contempt, it is important to note that the identification of a number of facial expressions accompanying our feeling that we are superior to or better than others with the label contempt is reductive. And now perhaps it's time to share the handout with you because I have, give me a minute, okay. So, I don't know why, but I can't scroll it down. Okay. So you can see the faces of disdain according to Darwin, and the photograph that that Ekman has in his discussion of contempt, this man. Now, the fact that Ekman and Friesen exclude other facial or vocal expressions of contempt is due to the fact that the raised and tightened corner of the upper lip is, in their analysis, the only involuntary response to others' inferiority. But for us, as historians of emotions, the facial or other self-conscious expressions of contempt, for example, scornful laughter, averted gazes, raised noses, or eyebrows, are heuristically important because they help us look into the social categories or moral failures that deserved ancient contempt and explore the pragmatics of relevant social performances. A methodological note, however, may be useful at this point. According to a line of interpretation, discussion of ancient emotions takes as a starting point Aristotle's or other philosophers' systematic treatments of emotions. In this presentation, I eschew detailed analysis of Aristotle's substantial treatment of contempt in his definition of anger. My omission of detailed treatment of contempt in Aristotle's definition of anger is due to the fact that orge and its causes has unsurprisingly received extensive discussion in recent scholarship, perhaps more discussion than any other emotion, with the possible exception of the equally attention-seeking pity. Yet, it is important for the purposes of the present study, looking into social scripts of contempt rather than systematic definitions of the emotion, to emphasize that Aristotle's comments on contempt underscore mainly its performative aspects in social interactions. As he says, belittlement, oligoria, and thus contempt is an actualization of opinion, energia doxis, energeia doxis, about what seems worthless. As we shall see in my discussion of the output elements of contempt, Aristotle adduces several examples of socially meaningful actualizations, that is, social performances of individuals' low opinion for others. Notably, the performances of contempt that Aristotle adduces include deliberate displays of the emotion. Most common words through which Greeks designate contempt are the verbs kataphroneo, periphroneo, and the cognate nouns kataphronesis, periphronesis. But as we saw, in some usages, the labels designating contempt, including kataphroneo, commonly denote one's emotionally neutral indifference or the trivializing of an issue. A good example is the metonymical use of the verb periorao, to look sideways at, which takes both animate and inanimate objects. Notably, the source domains of embodied metaphors or metonymies for contempt commonly involve modes of looking at someone. Apart from peri-orao, contempt is also designated through hupo compounds. So look from under, hupo blepo, or look askance, para blepo. While the metonymic uses of the verb huper orao are semantically identical with the English phrasal verb look down on. As we shall see, raised eyebrows are another indicator of pride or arrogance and appear saliently in contexts in which individuals express, verbally or non-verbally, contempt. In the scripts that we find in our ancient sources, averted gazes commonly but not exclusively express contempt. Refusing to meet others' eyes is a way of refusing to acknowledge their presence. When one may compare here the Chinese expression showing the whites of one's eyes, indicating the agent's unwillingness to establish eye contact with the target, even as typically an averted gaze is a sign of respect in Asian cultures. Sideways glances also indicate contempt. Ocular expressions of contempt seem to prevail in contexts of erotic communication or persuasion and reflect normative concerns or one's relative position in social hierarchy. And the relevant passages, averted gazes, we will come back to these passages. So all those passages concern gazes. A fragment from a comic play by Amphis, this is fragment 30 in the Poete Comici Greci, provides a good example of how averted gazes are enlisted in support of manipulative uses of contempt in social interactions. In this fragment, give me a minute to find it. Perhaps you can follow the handout which I have distributed. Provides a good example. Yes, so this is a good example of how averted gazes are enlisted in support of manipulative uses of contempt in social interactions. In this fragment, a character describes fishmongers' disdainful behavior towards their customers. The implications of social status for the type of behavior that a decent citizen vainly expects from the merchants of the Athenian agora is salient in this passage and enhances comicality. So it's a million times easier to go to the generals and be thought to deserve an audience and get an answer to your questions than when you go to the damn fishmongers in the marketplace. As for them, if someone picks up one of the fish lying there and asks about it, he first stares silently at the ground, ekupsen, as if he wasn't paying any attention, prosechon uden, and hadn't heard. The other fellow gets angry and then, without pronouncing his words completely by taking off a syllable, that would be 4 obols, spet obols. Anyone who buys fish has to listen to this sort of thing. As Olson points out, the use of dialect, no doubt intended to cause audiences laughter, underscores the fishmonger's calculated contempt. The fact that the speaker classifies himself among those who can have a discussion with the city's generals further emphasizes the undeserved disdain with which he is treated by the fishmonger. Staring at the ground and thus refusing to respond to the customer's words, corresponding to Roman Jakobson's phatic function of language, are rude and intimidating gestures of contempt through which the fishmonger introduces his negotiation of the product's prices. Correlatively, in a comic fragment by Alexis, fishmongers' raised eyebrows and averted gazes, kato vlepondas, are compared to the raised eyebrows of Athenian generals. The speaker's strong response to this behavior of upward contempt is expressed metonymically with a verb denoting in an embodied fashion his aversion. It makes him choke, apopnigomai. Averted gazes and swaggering are conjoined in a passage from Aristophanes' Clouds, and in this passage, the divine chorus expresses, albeit comically, their admiration for Socrates. You walk proudly in the streets and cast your eyes askance and endure many hardships with bare feet, and reliance upon us looked supercilious. Socrates' superciliousness is portrayed here, albeit comically, as an indication of his superiority among current natural philosophers, tonin meteorosophiston. His swaggering in the streets suggests a mode of public comportment intended to be seen by his fellow citizens, while his austere simplicity, mirrored in his grave countenance, is reminiscent of the enactments of Spartan austerity and the elite friends of Conon, the defendant in Demosthenes 54, display in the streets of Athens. Socrates' sideways glances in this context, indicating his contempt for others, are presented as being in correlative relationship with another characteristic which isolated him from common people, his extraordinary endurance, which perhaps was also interpreted as a display of superiority. Alcibiades' encomiastic words in the Symposium, drawing on Socrates' superciliousness in the clouds, are meant to restore the true meaning of Socrates' countenance. Alcibiades' response to Aristophanes' line is enlisted in support of his praise of Socrates. Alcibiades' framing of Socrates' sidelong glances and posture enhanced the portrayal of an ugly, snub-nosed man who, as he reveals earlier in the dialogue, refused to reciprocate his erotic advancements. Socrates' sidelong glances target both friends and enemies. Socrates' almost apotropaic gazes create an unbridgeable distance between him and everyone else. In Alcibiades' eyes, Socrates' calmness or aloofness quite literally embodies cardinal values such as extraordinary endurance and self-restraint. Socrates' behavior is understood as supercilious and is thus reciprocated with disdain. His barefoot walking on the frost invited his fellow soldiers in Potidea to look at him askance, hypeblepon, because they thought that his endurance was a display of contempt directed against them, os katafronundas phon. Similarly, Socrates' refusal to accept the sexual gratification that Alcibiades wants to offer him is understood by the archetypical hubristes of classical Athens as a sign of hubris and contempt, katefronesen. Alcibiades' frustration leads him to interpret Socrates' self-restraint as an indication of scornful disdain and indifference for his beauty. The reversal of normative roles in this passage is also significant. Alcibiades' description of his attempt to seduce his Erastes lays him open to the unsubstantiated accusations that Aeschines directed against Timarchus almost a century later, accusations focusing on what allegedly happened in the houses of Timarchus' successive lovers. Hence, Alcibiades' attempt to anticipate the symposiast's scorn when he claims that the contents of his narration are not appropriate for profane and boorish listeners. Notably, in anticipation of his listeners' reception of his story, the words with which Alcibiades tries to convince Socrates to reciprocate his love construct imaginary audiences to which he would have to account for refusing to gratify a man like Socrates. As he says, it would be more shameful to confess that he refused to offer himself in front of a sensible audience than confess that he did so in the presence of a mass of hoi polloi. The imagined, unsophisticated, and uncouth audiences would no doubt emphasize the problematic behavior of a younger man who struggles indecorously to offer erotic charis to an older man. In other words, Alcibiades' proposal jeopardizes his reputation and thus intensifies the intimidation that he experiences as a self-defined target of Socrates' contempt. Now, averted gazes quite commonly emerge in scripts of unreciprocated erotic proposals, which are characterized by scornful rejection and intimidation of the prospective lover. A good example is offered in Pseudo-Theocritian Idyll 20, in which Unica, presumably a courtesan from the city, scornfully rejects the advances of a young shepherd. The emotional script in this poem combines contempt with disgust and emphasizes social status. Civic snobbery versus rustic physicality. Now, Greeks were perhaps less reluctant to express and manipulate physical dirt or other bodily qualities to express their low esteem for social inferiors. Unica's gestures suggest that her contempt for the rustic boy also involves anxiety about possible defilement. Her understanding of the boy as a possible threat is emphasized by her gesture of spitting 3 times in her bosom. At the same time, the young shepherd, presumably because of his erotic excitement and his rustic pride, readily engages in interpretation of her body language. The girl's sidelong glance is ambiguous. The context makes it possible to interpret her examining gaze as one of feigned anger, or more probably, in my view, contempt or disdain, or both. The facial expressions and gestures that accompany her gazes are quite unequivocal because they involve conscious gestures of disdain. Parting the lips and snorting suggests scornful laughter. The girl conveys her contempt explicitly earlier in the poem when she refuses to reciprocate the shepherd's kiss by stating that she has learned to kiss gentle astika rather than rustic lips, agroikos philein. The script of the poem under discussion enlists the emotions of contempt and disgust in support of the author's attempt to highlight bucolic pride and establish the superiority of his own poetry over more monumental genres of poetry, as Fantuzzi has put it. The girl's contemptuous rejection of his rustic love urges the shepherd to curse her angrily in a fashion that underlines his and her monolithic understanding of civic and rustic environment as 2 separate, incompatible realms. For in his response to the girl's dismissive renunciatio amoris, he invokes Kypris with the request to inflict on the girl, a courtesan, sexual marginalization, both on the hills and in the city, and solitary sleeping. Now, the uses of spitting in social interactions are perhaps more ambivalent than those of other bodily substances. In Greek, strong disapproval or contemptibility may be described metonymically through the words kataptuo, spit at, and kataptustos, to be spat at, and apoptuo, to spit out. Apoptuo is perhaps more akin to the phenomenology of disgust insofar as it construes loathsome individuals as offensive substances which must urgently be removed from the mouth and the body. So now you have some ugly items here. But kataptistos qualifies a loathsome person who elicits chiefly contempt. Note, for example, that in Sophocles' Antigone, Haemon spits at his father's face, who is now an enemy, perhaps quite ironically, since earlier in the play, Creon had bitterly asked his son to spit out Antigone as an enemy and let her find another husband in Hades. Interestingly, an ancient scholiast who presumably thought that spitting at one's father's face was unimaginable writes, looking contemptuously with his expression, but spitting in one's bosom was sometimes employed and is still employed in Greece as a self-protective gesture, which when one believed that one was exposed to danger. Hence, the gesture's ambivalence, discussed by Douglas Kearns in a 2005 publication. Unica's spitting 3 times in her bosom is directly relevant to her understanding of the shepherd as physically offensive, a possible threat of defilement that invites an apotropaic gesture through which she distances herself from the boy. But at the same time, her triple spitting serves as an embodied metonymy for her disdain, insofar as it communicates vividly her rejection of the prospective lover. The context of this script encourages an as-if interpretation of her gesture, which, however, acquires semantic specificity because of its resonances with instances in which prospective lovers' evil eye, baskanoi, are presented as being harmfully disempowering. The mechanics of the nostrils and nasal noises are also important in ancient displays of contempt. The verb mukterizo, to snort, indicates strong disapproval or contempt for an action, a statement, or an individual. In addition, speaking through the nose is common in a number of papyri reflecting aggressors' performances of contempt and disgust directed against their targets. In one of them, an official collecting taxes describes a man's response in the following way: he snorted his contempt for me and wanted to attack me. The lower body and its products emerge in instances where individuals verbally express or behave obscenely to express their superiority by humiliating their targets. Secretions, excrement, and generally bodily fluids are, of course, typical elicitors of disgust. Disgust and contempt typically make us want to distance ourselves from the targets, albeit for significantly different reasons. Because disgust is a particularly visceral sentiment involving ideations of contamination, the emotion centers on physical dirt, even in cases where it is projected upon others by way of indicating their moral failures. By contrast, contempt, an emotion that involves comparison of the agent with the target, does not defile others by way of establishing the agent's superiority. What makes us want to distance ourselves from or avoid social interaction with the objects of our contempt is their intangible moral failures or other normative transgressions rather than perceived blending of moral with physical dirt. Contempt invites us to treat others as socially invisible. Disgust dehumanizes. This cursory comparison of contempt with disgust has significant implications for the deployment of physical dirt in relevant emotion scripts. Although in modern languages, shit is commonly employed as a means of indicating one's target's contemptibility, for example, Demos is a piece of shit, I was unable to find relevant metonymical uses in the Greek sources with the possible exception of the verb skubalizo. This of course is not to say that feces do not play an important role in others' belittlement in our extant literature. Breaking hot air in the face of a person is certainly a strong indication of extreme contempt, as is the case in a lost comedy and in Epicrates, where a Sicilian doctor farts in the faces of people talking nonsense. His rude gesture seems to identify their words with hot air. Urinating on others, literally or figuratively, is of course another aggressive way of belittling them. Now, the pseudepigraphic Theocritian poem that we examined earlier makes clear the fundamental role of laughter in performances of contempt, performances which reflect modes of laughing akin to the facial repertoire of expressions identified as output elements of the emotions phenomenology. Stephen Halliwell's recent in-depth analysis of Greek laughter offers detailed discussion of the lexical markers and episodes of scornful laughter in Greece. Halliwell also discusses critically modern theories of laughter, and therefore, in the limited space of my presentation today, I outlined the most salient interfaces of laughter with contempt. Superiority theory of laughter is, self-evidently, more akin than other theories to contempt, an emotion which, as we saw, establishes that the agent is better than the target and the target is lesser than the agent. No theory of laughter succeeds in providing a full and satisfactory account of the phenomenon. We learn to laugh without studying the grammar of laughter. One of the most important shortcomings of all theories of laughter is that they investigate humor or comic strategies rather than laughter itself. Be that as it may, superiority theory, or just the notion that laughter can be harmful insofar as it compromises its target's honor and hence is consequential rather than playful, to use Halliwell's terms, is compatible with the cultural understandings that emerge in our sources. Even a cursory reading of, say, Sophocles' Ajax, where laughing at one's enemy's failures is identified as the most self-satisfying type of laughter, makes it clear that enemy's laughter is conceived, at least by a person of Ajax's caliber and size as an extreme form of humiliation. Superiority laughter is directly relevant to the fundamental concept of hubris, which has been the object of much scholarly work. As we know, hubris is one of the three types of belittlement, which, according to Aristotle, cause anger. The other two are spitefulness, mouchteria, and contemptuous behavior, kataphronesis. Now, this is not the place to offer detailed analysis of hubris, of course, but be it sufficient to note that hubris includes attitudes which show that one thinks big and may lead to actions which establish one's superiority through the shaming of others. Hence, in democratic Athens, hubris was thought to be a deeply antisocial and undemocratic attitude commonly associated with wealth and pro-oligarchic predilections. Laughter is commonly an inextricable element of hubristic acts of violence through which individuals advocate their superiority over others. In the analysis of the traits, ethos of the young in the rhetoric, Aristotle suggests that they are lovers of laughter, philogelotes, and therefore witty, eutrapeloi, because wit is educated hubris, pepaideumene hubris. This locution is prima facie oxymoronic. An educated epikis man should never behave hubristically. In the rhetoric, Aristotle identifies eutrapelia as the middle position which characterizes the virtues, while excess, bomologos, and deficiency, agroikos, are respectively characterized by boorishness and harshness. Eutrapelia is stylish, elegant, and socially adjustable joking. Yet one should not underplay the aggressive and humiliating implications of hubris in Aristotle's construal of eutrapelia. According to Aristotle, jokes are a type of loidorema, insulting, and hence a gesture that compromises the target's sense of honor. No matter how stylish they are, jokes either diminish, albeit playfully, or they are not jokes at all. In our sources, the words loidoria, loidorema commonly designate exchange of insults, especially between young men, or abusive language forbidden by the law. Indeed, in his description of gentlemanly eutrapelia, Aristotle observes that playful jokes are leidorimata, insults, some of which lawgivers forbid. But the gracious man, characterized by mesotis, will serve as a law to himself. The rich vocabulary of Greek laughter includes several words which are resonant with the facial expressions most commonly associated with contempt. We already noticed Unica's scornful laughter. Sneer is sometimes associated with snub-nosed people. Give me a minute to find the relevant examples. So, sneer is sometimes associated with snub-nosed people who thus resemble the satyrs and by implication Socrates, while parted lips, sairo, resonate with the raised upper lip, which is typical facial expression of contempt. In an epigram, the eye of the poem describes Eros as a sneering simagelon, while in another epigram, the narrator imagines that he is in open battle with Eros and sets in fire his weapons. In the final part of my discussion of the emotions phenomenology, I turn briefly my attention to verbal modes of expressing the emotion, which may or may not be accompanied by nonverbal bodily displays. Refusal to respond to another person's words, that is silence, is an obvious way of conveying contempt. A locus classicus, and indeed a locus admired by Longinus for its affective power, appears as early as Homer, when in the Odyssey, Ajax refuses to respond to Odysseus' plea in Hades. The implications of Ajax's silence are underscored by his withdrawal from the scene of his encounter with Odysseus, a gesture which contradicts other souls' eagerness to come close, physically and verbally, to Odysseus. Ajax responds to Odysseus' warm words by turning his back to his rival and going back to Erebus. Verbal expressions of contempt in antiquity include linguistic usages which coincide with common usages in modern languages. For example, the use of the plural to refer to a certain individual, suggesting that the target represents a group of people sharing specific negative behavioral traits, and Aristotle's forgetfulness of names, that is, pretending that you cannot remember the name of a person. Diminutives also serve the purpose of belittling others, even as their use may sometimes reflect affectionate treatment or benign scornfulness or derision. Among the uses of diminutives, the most illustrative is perhaps the qualification anthropion. A passage from Lucian's Cataplus displays saliently, in a context where bodily aspects of Contempt's repertoire are fully deployed, the connotations of the qualification anthropion. And perhaps I should read this passage because I find it particularly interesting, and I will skip the final section of my paper to accept questions and discuss possible objections or comments. I read the ancient Greek text in my own modern Greek, in my modern Greek, in a modern Greek way of doing it, and you can follow the archaic English translation, which I found in Loeb. So it's Megapenthes who speaks. He's dead, he's a tyrant, and he says, «Καρίον ο αιμός οικέτης επί τάχιστα με αποθανόντα είδε, περί δίλην οψίαν, ανελθόν εις το οίκημα εν θα εκείμην, σχολής ούσης, ουδείς γαρ ουδέ εθήλατε με, γλυκέριον την παλακίδα μου, και πάλε δε είμαι, και κοινωνίκεσαν, παραγαγών επισπασάμενος την θύραν, εσπόδι, καθάπερ ουδενός ένδων παρόντος. Ήτα, επειδή άλλης είχε της επιθυμίας, αποβλέψας εις εμέ, σήμεν τη φυσήν ομοιαρών ανθρώπιων πληγάσμι πολλάκις ουδέν αδικούντι ενέτεινας. Και ταύθαμα λέγον, παρέτη λέτε με, και κατακόρης έπε, τέλος δε πλατή χρεμψάμενος καταπτήσας μου και εις των ασεβών χωρονάπηθη. This passage shows lucidly how suppressed sentiments of contempt are expressed by oppressed people when their oppressors are unable to use the power and violence which secure their control over their inferiors. The tyrant Megapenthes, who on account of his injustice and outrageous crimes is refused the water of forgetfulness in Hades, recounts how after his death his slave Carrion indulged in sex with Glycerion, his female slave and mistress, in the presence of his dead body. By deploying the power of sexual control to establish hierarchies, and hence by presenting the slave as endorsing tyrant's behavior, the passage underlines the reversal of the power dynamics between the two men. The effectiveness and comicality of the passage lies in the fact that it blurs the limits between life and death. Megapenthes, for example, underscores his slave's shamelessness by suggesting that he had intercourse with, or rather raped, Glycerion in the presence of his corpse, as if no one was present, while the slave's effrontery is underscored by the confrontational use of you, su, that introduces his address to his master, and of the particle mentoi, which suggests that his disrespectful action in his master's presence was a calculated act of revenge. Furthermore, when he satisfies his sexual desire, the slave looks directly in Megapenthes' eyes, a gesture which saliently indicates his insolence and establishes the revengeful nature of his sexual act. Impossible as it is, Carrion's confrontational eye contact with Megapenthes, apoblέψas, is a prideful display of superiority, a display which would have caused severe punishment when the slave's master was alive. The master's moral qualification as a miaron anthropion, little villain, reveals that in the script under discussion, the slave's sentiments go beyond anger and frustration. The slave is also full of contempt for his master. Miaron anthropion involves both moral evaluation in the aggressive and wrongful master, it involves both moral evaluation of the aggressive and wrongful master and the reversal of power dynamics facilitated by death. Hence, the slave hawks a big gob of phlegm and spits at Megapenthe's face. Now, I think it's high time I stopped. I will not go on with my discussion of Demosthenes 18, because I think it would be much better to have 30 minutes for discussion, and I'm sure that you're now tired. What I tried to do, to wrap up very, very briefly, what I tried to do here was, first of all, to offer some clarifications of the possible scripts of contempt that we may have in our or in ancient cultures, which depend on the questions or the issues of status and moral appraisals. As I said, there are specific scripts of contempt which require status and just status, and other cases in which contempt involves moral evaluation and are thus directed, and then the emotion is directed against persons rather than groups. But at the same time, we may have cases where both moral evaluations and status work together to belittle others. Now, in the second part of my talk, I tried to give you an overview of the output elements of contempt. In other words, the phenomenology of the emotion, even if the first part was relevant to the phenomenology of the emotion insofar as the affect program or the phenomenology of any emotion includes the causes that elicit the emotion. And what I would like to emphasize is what I didn't give you. Although I tried to find representations of contempt in the arts, especially vase paintings, I have to admit that I didn't find any examples, and I would be very, very grateful to you if you could provide examples which would facilitate my work. I don't think that contempt is a very strong candidate. Grief, of course, is an obvious candidate in emotion scripts that we find in the art. Even hope, representations of hope or other emotions. Disgust, yes, sometimes, but contempt perhaps is not an obvious example, or not a very easily detectable emotion. But I hope that through my discussion of the output elements of contempt, and through my discussion of the embodied experience of contempt, I have offered you an outline of what it would be like to experience and communicate contempt in ancient Greece. Thank you very much for your attention.
Emiliano, te iba a dar la...
Claudia, no te escuché, ¿eh? No se te oyó o yo no oí.
No, te daba la palabra para el agradecimiento y luego íbamos a...
Bueno, so thank you, Dimas, very much. It was a very nice conference, very comprehensive. You dealt with many different aspects of contempt, and I'm sure that this is going to generate a lot of questions. I have a question on my own, but I would rather have maybe other people asking their questions. Claudia, I don't know whether you want to organize the question.
You can begin if you want. No, thank you very much, Dimos. Really, it was a very illustrative talk. Really, it is the complexity of that emotion and the examples you you dealt with the comic examples has to do with my own research. That's why I'm Emiliano and I, you know, we work on comedy. So many examples came from comedy. Mm-hmm. So perhaps one question has to do with that, not? I mean, the relationship of this emotion with the genre, something like that. But perhaps Emiliano has a question similar to mine. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Claudia. Yes, maybe my question was a little more specific, which is something that has been coming to my mind while listening to you. This idea that you can experience contempt towards some other person. So there is, of course, this idea of superiority, and at the same time, you're disdaining or expressing contempt towards another one. And my question was, when I was listening to this aspect of body language and the phenomenology of the low body, and especially defecation, the idea that to some extent, there's also an aspect of disdaining some material objects. I was thinking of this passage in Birds, in which the inspector asks Peseteros whether he remembers when he was defecating on a pillar, on an inscription. And this is a way of showing that Pesetero was showing disdain towards the institutions of the polis, the judicial institutions of the polis. And so now you are trying to quote relevant laws, whereas in the past, you were just shitting on the pillars in Athens. So what about the material aspect of contempt? Can you show contempt towards objects representing values? Or do you think that contempt can only be addressed towards other people? I don't know, it's just an open question I'm thinking aloud. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if you can, I don't know if you can show contempt towards inanimate objects. I suppose you can't. But what you can certainly do is use body products to indicate your contempt. So I suppose the idea of what is this is this the case where Kinesias is presenting as emptying his bowels all over the place?
No, as far as I remember, this is Birds. I think it should be around verse 1000 something, which is the inspector that comes to the city.
Ah, yes, okay.
And he reminds Peseteros when in the past he was shitting on the pillars as a way of showing that, well, at least this is my reading of the passage, showing that Peseteros was just disdaining, like considering that these aspects of the city were kind of inferior, not trusting the institutions.
Yeah, I suppose yes. What you have here, but what you have there again, okay, yeah. So in that case, I would take the objects as symbols. Okay, so the objects there, they symbolize an institution, and what you show contempt for is the institution, an abstraction really, which, as is typically the case with even verbal, when you don't do it, I mean. But even when you use it verbally, you employ the lower body and its products as metonymies for something. So yes, this is, I suppose, a clear indication of contempt, as is also the case in Latin, contemnere, for inanimate objects, for values, for disrespect for something which others perhaps respect. So, but in that case, I suppose contempt would be the equivalent of disrespect rather than anything else. Even if the agent may want to indicate his or her contempt for the institutions or anything else, okay. Yeah, I mean, if I go into a church and I empty my bladder in there, of course, yeah, I want to, I suppose if I'm not crazy, what I want to do is indicate that those who go there and, you know, believe in God and use the place as a sacred place and priest and so on are stupid, or that I I don't really care about them, and I find what they're doing ridiculous or dangerous or whatever. So I suppose, yeah, this is what it stands for, what the place or the object stands for, rather than what is the object of your contempt.
Thank you, Dimos. That's very interesting.
And Dimos, if you want to answer my question, I mean the relationship of contempt with the comedy. I was thinking about that the genre has a special freedom to show contempt because it is really very free to show, I mean, bodily reactions, low bodily reactions. So it's like a place, a special place just to show contempt. What do you think about that?
Well, yes, I agree. I suppose that a major element related to comedy is the idea of out-groups and in-groups and the construction of hierarchies in terms of in-groups and out-groups, and what you do with the butt of the comedy, with the target of the jokes and so on. So I suppose that comedy and satire always, and especially satire, always endorses a standpoint of superiority, even if in this case it asserts well-established values, and in this case it's not radical. In this sense, it's not radical. So I suppose the idea is exactly what you do with the objects, with the targets, the butt of your jokes. And now, not everyone would agree that comedy creates outgroups that it targets. There is a very interesting paper by Ian Ruffell who questions this kind of bipolar analysis of comedy, indicating that even the audience may sometimes be the butts of the joke, and that this is part of the playfulness of the comedy. But I suppose that the idea is that laughter, as I said, and comedy anyway would no doubt, undoubtedly, require some sort of a sense of superiority to work, as I said. And in this, I think Aristotle is correct when he says that jokes in general are educated hubris. And I think that what he says, it may be educated, it may belong to an epikis, because Aristotle, doesn't like people who go to the symposia and don't laugh and are extremely serious, and but when he says that it is educated hubris, as I said, I don't think that we should underestimate that jokes and laughter and comedy are not jokes, comedy, and so on. If they are not hubristic, they have to be hubristic. There is a sense of belittlement. Of course, it may be benign and so on, but I cannot make a joke. If I want to laugh at Emiliano, not laugh at him, but make a joke about Emiliano, it won't be a joke if he doesn't feel a little bit belittled, if he doesn't feel that I take a stance of superiority for the very moment that I'm doing this joke. And that's why sometimes jokes didn't have a good ending in antiquity and in modern days, because not everyone, and actually Aristotle, if you read his analysis of laughter, Aristotle pays too much attention to audiences, to the person who is the object of your laughter, rather than just the person who produces a joke. And this is very, very important, I think. So yes, laughter cannot exist without contempt, as far as I can see, but
okay.
Benign.
Okay, thank you. And there's a question in the chat. Perhaps you can read it by yourself, because my English is not good enough.
Sorry, I'll read it aloud because
okay.
It will help me understand what is said there. Okay. Well, maybe my question is a little bit general, but if we can characterize contempt as a power judgment directed by someone who perceives himself or herself, or indeed is in a higher place in the social scale towards someone perceived as inferior, can we consider a subversive use of kataphronesis in later philosophical developments that reverses the relationship of power by spiritualizing power in terms of power over one's own behavior and redirecting contempt towards the very objects and behaviors that constitute the marks of external superiority that the other holds? Okay, this is a very complicated question, I suppose, and there are too many questions in this question. But if I get it right, is the question, I suppose, is the question. So I suppose the question is, can someone feel legitimate contempt for others? Is this the main nucleus of the question? Is this the core of the question?
Perhaps Fernando can do it. Fernando can speak by himself.
I don't know if you're hearing me.
Yeah,
yes?
I can hear you.
I was typing on the chat. Maybe it is like this motive of vanitas, right? That it's so frequent. You know, the contempt for the things that in social life people hold as important, and a very common motive in Hellenistic philosophy and later is the idea of reversing that distribution by showing contempt for the things that the powerful exhibit as the mark of their superiority.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. Yes, of course, it can exist, this type of, yes, of course. But I suppose that in this case, philosophers assume for themselves when they reverse social hierarchies, I suppose that they assume or they endorse the standpoint of the superior rather than the inferior, because it's a lack of understanding and moral education of those who exhibit this vain type of contempt. I suppose this is what you mean. So yes, of course it can exist. Yeah, but again, it becomes a top-down contempt in the sense that it's a type of contempt directed against the uneducated and vain and vainglorious people who do not understand that external goods are nothing anyways. This would be an answer. And my other, well, to speak about what you say here now introduces a very interesting question, which is contempt a moral emotion? Is it a legitimate emotion? Is it, for example, in English, okay, nobody nowadays uses the word contempt, and the verb to contemn sounds archaic. And one of the reasons why it sounds archaic is simply because it's not politically correct to say that you feel contempt for others or that you contemn others. Okay, but on the other hand, it is a big issue if contempt is a legitimate emotion that we may use against social groups of people. And there are people now out there arguing that contempt is the right response, should be the right response to racists, for example. So instead of attacking or exercising violence against racists and so on, one way to deal with them is to deal with them in terms of contempt, of displaying your sense of superiority in moral standards, in moral issues. And if you're interested, I can send you relevant bibliography. I mean, Fernando, you and others. Okay, so it is a big issue now. It is a big question now, the moral uses of contempt. And I think these people are right. I think these people are right, that contempt has many advantages. Disgust never has any advantages because it dehumanizes practically. Okay, to say that a racist is rubbish or is shit or is dirty, it would be the same, it would be the equivalent of endorsing the rhetoric of Nazis. Okay, who thought that the Jews were rats or presented the Jews as vermin and rats and so on. So it's not an answer to racists to say that they're disgusting. Because in the end of the day, you know, they can take a shower. But contempt perhaps is a legitimate response to racism or other unwanted, okay, types of behavior.
Okay, thank you. Maria Cecilia has another question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Yes,
well.
but we can't see you.
No?
No, yes, we can see you now.
Well, thank you very much for your lecture, very stimulating. My question when I raised the hand was a bit related to Claudia, but I was thinking in Aristotle's rhetoric, when he says that Gorgias has an autos legon, and he agreed with him that you should laugh when things are very serious, or be serious when people are laugh. I was just wondering about this positive. In a way, love is can be a sort of contempt, and this positive way of thinking in Gorgias, in Aristotle. If you could comment this. But I was also wondering, but this is a huge question or a problem for me, how we take so serious, I am a professor of philosophy, and how we take so serious Plato's dialogue, in which sometimes he's so ironic, he made a lot of contempt, but you think, not a contempt, but it's very subtle. But we think in so seriously in Plato's, in some passages of Plato's dialogue, in which he presents some people like Gorgias or even Protagoras, in Menexenus, and you can see this sort of contempt for the other opinion and distortion. Do you have any suggestion about thinking this? This is a question that I have been concerned with, teaching philosophy and teaching Plato, how to deal with this in Plato, because sometimes the commenters of Plato are so serious about this drama that Plato put on philosophical stage. Well, thank you.
So thank you. Concerning your first question about Gorgias, actually I've written about it in a Mnemosiny article back in the, I can't remember now, 2006, because laughter is one of my favorite topics as well in the orators. And what I think Aristotle says there, and he says that, orthos legon, as you said, he says that, yeah, of course, this is what you should do. I suppose his Gorgias statement does not so much have to do with contempt, as, of course, it may have to do with contempt in the sense that you try to belittle others, but I think it's a different aspect of laughter that he advises there. And perhaps this is, I think it's primarily, the advice is primarily direct, it primarily concerns the manipulation of audiences. And I suppose the idea is that when someone is serious about a point, the best thing you have to do if you want to divert audiences' attention from what the speaker is saying is to make them laugh. And conversely, if they laugh, try to make them understand that laughter, that what is being discussed is important and that they shouldn't laugh with it. I think that the best example of these uses of laughter in the orators, in oratory, is Demosthenes 54, where in the Against Conon, which is a case of violence. And I think this is a very good example because it becomes obvious from the speaker, because obviously we don't have the defense speech, but I think it becomes obvious from the prosecution, from Ariston, that he anticipates, or he says so, that his opponents will treat what he presents as an act of hubris. His opponents will present it as a playful instance of mild violence among young people in the Agora of Athens, and that for this reason the speaker should not have introduced the case to the court. So practically what he is doing there is trying to invest in hubris and the importance of hubris, the prosecutor, I mean, because perhaps he understands that his opponents will say that, okay, nothing happened really, you know, we make jokes, we insult others because we are young and so on, we get drunk, and these things just happen. And this guy simply does not understand what to do when he is bullied or when he receives violence by other young people, which is simply to retaliate or respond or, you know, fight back. Okay. Or just, you know, just participate in the jokes or try to answer. But he didn't. He brought the case to the court. Now, Plato, I don't know. I mean, this would be a huge. Well, to say that Plato shows contempt for his interlocutors would be, well, I suppose it's an experiential question that I cannot answer because we don't know if Plato felt contempt for the interlocutors. All we know is what Socrates says in a very dramatized environment. So I don't know. Well, quite possibly Plato himself, from what he says in all the dialogues, felt contempt for the uneducated, the lower, the masses, and so on. But this is not an exception. All those who criticize democracy, all those who who criticize democracy, or philosophers, you know, are not the best friends of democracy in antiquity or classical antiquity. We know that very well. Yeah, I mean, to say that that people in the cities need a shepherd, I suppose it is not a very is not something that would not intimidate us in modern democracies. But the fact that he shows contempt for interlocutors, now I suppose it has to do with Socrates' ironic stance. It has to do with Socrates questioning and so on. So, but interestingly, when Socrates receives, Socrates never makes ad hominem attacks, never. He makes very subtle comments. And actually what Socrates criticizes very subtly as well is when his interlocutors make ad hominem attacks in which he is the target. So I wouldn't say that say Gorgias is the object of Plato's contempt. People like Dionysodorus and his brother in the Euthydemus, perhaps, but again, no, I don't see the personal element required for contempt. But certainly the person who is time and again presented as hubristes for all sorts of reasons in Plato is Socrates. Mm-hmm. Not only in the symposium that I discussed, also in the Phaedrus and so on.
May I just add something? Because I'm thinking, for instance, in some moments, it's not exactly against a person. In the case, for instance, of Borges, even some people like, oh my God, they think, the professor for Harvard who died, Siegel, thinks, for instance, that Borges is only in the first third of the dialogue because it's a sort of deference to him by Plato. Anyway, but I'm thinking not only direct to person precisely, but to a group. For instance, when in Republic 2 or 9 or in Gorgias, when Socrates says, oh, I'll give you an image, and you know how powerful is the image for Plato persuasively, but I'll give you an image because it's, in some sense, it's easier to understand. For some people, you give image and they're not able to follow an argument, an logos. Is this sort of some moments, very briefly in some dialogues, in which you see a sort of contempt for some, almost some strategy that even Plato used sometimes. Is this sort of kind. But anyway, I know it's a big issue.
Yes, okay, I understand what you're saying. But again, his arguments are complicated enough to require images, even for the stupid. And well, yeah, this would be a very, very long discussion now, but I don't think that this would be contempt. And by the way, I think that these are arguments that even Plato needs to construct his thesis. Even in places where he says, okay, I will produce an image. Okay, images are very tricky in Plato.
Thank you.
Okay. I think that there's no more question and we are just in time. So I would like to thank again very much, Dimos, for your wonderful talk, for sharing with us this moment. And Emiliano, just please close this.
I think that Dimos deserves us to turn on our microphones and make a huge applause across the Atlantic and the Mediterranean towards Crete. So thank you, Dimos.
No, I thank you very much. I thank you. Thanks a lot.
Wonderful presentation, Dimos. Thank you very much for your time and your energy and having said yes as soon as we invited you. So thank you for your predisposition.
Enjoy the spring afternoon in Argentina.
And hopefully we'll have you in Argentina next time, in presence, in person.
I'd be delighted, and anyone who wants to come and visit Crete, just let me know, okay?
Don't say it again, don't say it again. Nos acaba de invitar a Creta, así que cuando vayamos a Creta, por favor, allí le tocaremos el timbre a Dimos. Bueno, muchas gracias a todos. Solo nos resta con Claudia, más allá de agradecerles, contarles que tenemos prevista la última conferencia del año sobre este ciclo de emociones. Posiblemente el año que viene sigamos profundizando el ciclo y ampliándolo. La exposición va a ser el 27 de noviembre. Todavía la oradora no nos confirmó el título, va a ser Irene Bisbardi. Irene está trabajando en Wesleyan University y ha trabajado algunos aspectos sobre emociones en la tragedia y en los coros, así que seguramente por esa línea nos estará proponiendo su tema. 27 de noviembre, ya lo pueden agendar.
Emiliano, sorry to cut you, and also a graduate of the University of Crete.
Thank you very much. Y bueno, entonces quedamos así, 27 de noviembre, seguramente el año que viene, hablando de University of Crete, esperemos tener a Melina Temiolaki, que estuvo en Argentina el año pasado, así que, y sabemos que es amiga de Dimos, así que Melina supongo que también estará el año próximo. Bueno, agradecidos a todos y a disposición para lo que necesiten. Gracias. Buen fin de semana.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias a todos. Hasta la próxima. Thank you, Dimos.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.